you have mentioned China several times in your books,
Yeah.
especially in the most time in the prefaces. Until now, there has been no official literature from you focusing on the question of modernity in China. So, what do you think makes the case of China special, maybe different both from the case in Japan and in the West? And what are the difficulties in discussing the problem of modernity in China?
Well, um, I am not an expert. That's the biggest problem. I don't know enough. I spent many years studying Japanese literature and philosophy, and I still wouldn't call myself a real expert, but at least I know enough to say something that can interest people who are experts. But in the case of China, I'm just not able to contribute. Uh, so that's a problem. That's why I've only written prefaces and not essays on China. I mean, we our experience of China in the West was mostly around politics,
Yes.
far more than around literature. Or there's of course a Chinese tradition, scientific and technical tradition that has been studied by. So there are important contributions of China to world technology before modern times. Um, and I'm aware of some of that, but that doesn't really help much with a study of Chinese modernity. Um, I thought at one time that I could learn something about it in terms of problems of socialist transition, but not, at this point, you would really need to understand what's happening in China in much more complex terms. If what is happening in China is a socialist transition, it is one without any precedent and without any serious theoretical basis. So, I mean, I guess I just can't help much with this question. What I would like is for Chinese scholars who read what I've written about Japan to say to themselves, well, maybe I can do something similar in the study of China, because they can know enough to be able to make a contribution. But it's more than a question of inspiration, of trying to inspire people to look at things in a new way. That's what I would like my work on Japan to do for people in China.
Yes, I think that's also one of the reasons why I want to do this research, because by looking into the case of Japan, sometimes we could find the way how we solve the problems of modernity, how to understand the different form of modernity in China. Even the case in China is more complicated and need further researchers. And so the second question is that even for the case in China, even with different social and political structures, the systems, China has faced a similar dilemma um, as you have talked in your book. For example, the ideology of worship for scientific and technological methodology, and also the hegemony of certain interest groups on technological rationality. And do you think this could be connected to the existing scientific and technological structure, which has been learned from the West?
Well, it's certainly the case that China is, as Japan did, imitating Western ideas, adopting Western technology and technical and scientific fields. Uh, that's the path to modernization is greatly accelerated by the availability of all these models
Yes.
from countries that have already done it. If you had to start from scratch and work your way up to the discovery of, the electric circuit, it would take a long time. So
Mhm.
it's a lot better to call up somebody at Siemens and say, "Can you send us a generator? Uh, we'll pay." And then you study it and figure out how to do it yourself. And that's the way both Japan and China have industrialized. Um, so, I'm getting a little lost here in the question. Uh,
So this process has led to a lot of
oh
problems
yeah, right.
as
Now I remember. You want this path of modernization naturally brings with it a cultural change. You're not going to get good scientists if science is not part of the school curriculum, right? You've got to um, you've got to change the way people are taught, and that will affect their mentality for the rest of their lives. And um, the ideological power of this Western idea of modernity is harnessed by the governments. They can say, look at how well we're doing modernizing your society. Now you have a car. What more can you ask? So the governments immediately latch on to this idea of scientific and technical progress as a reason why they should continue to rule. Now, this can lead then to similar kinds of problems from those that the critics of modernity in the West have identified.
yeah.
People's loss of a sense of the meaning of life, of any kind of personal dignity. Uh, People begin to see themselves as just cogs in a machine. That's a catastrophic result of having adopted machines. Huh? You should be in charge of the machines, not just one of the gears or levers in the machine. So, so yes, there's definitely a problem of the transmission of a culture which has its limits, and it's destructive of cultural traditions which may be valuable. As in the Kawabata novel, the the narrator says the beauty of go has left.
Yes.
Right? Once once the modern idea of winning takes over, the beauty of go has left because it's no longer a religious and spiritual and aesthetic activity. It's just a way of making money, basically, and that's destructive in ways that are regrettable. So, of course, you don't want to be stuck in the Middle Ages when
Yeah.
everything is religion and aesthetics. You want to be modern, but you want to retain some of those values that are inherited from the past in some modern form that makes sense. In Japan, for example, one way in which that has happened is the idea of vocation is very important still for Japanese people. This is an ancient idea that you um, train carefully for an activity of some a professional activity of some sort, and that you do this not just in order to master the tools of the trade, but in order to transform yourself. It's a way, a do, which and this idea persists in Japan to a considerable extent. Um, so, how do you preserve these values in the face of the hegemony of Western scientific technical rationality, which again, a critical approach is necessary. That's what all that Japanese literature was really about, trying to develop a critical approach so that something could be preserved. I guess in the case of China, the Cultural Revolution was an important turning point
Yeah.
because for us in the West who could not know what was happening, we got reports, but they were, of dubious value on the events. At first, it seemed that the Cultural Revolution was an attempt to break with the hegemony of scientific technical rationality in the Soviet form, in the form of a bureaucratic planned society. So the Cultural Revolution was interpreted by many people in the West as a response to the problem that was identified in Western critiques of modernity. Of course, a very unusual solution, a radical solution, a democratic solution, very different from things like, a return of Christianity or whatever people had thought up as an alternative in the West. Now, later we learned that whatever was happening in the early phases of the Cultural Revolution that may have had some political validity, it degenerated very quickly and became a problem rather than a solution.
Yes.
And that's so disappointing because that was then the basis on which China ceased to follow a path towards socialism in the way in which that had been understood in the past. I mean, conceivably, China's making its way to socialism in some new way, but it's very difficult to see what that is about, what that means. What seems mainly to be happening is that China is succeeding in industrializing. That's a huge achievement, but it's not quite the same thing as finding an alternative way of being modern. So, so the meaning of China for Westerners changed after the failure of the Cultural Revolution. It no longer seemed to offer an alternative. Um,
Yes, I think
yeah.
that's exactly the problems we Chinese are facing. So a lot of people want to find a way out of this kind of Western modernity and its negative impact on our society. So I think in some ways we should develop a critical theory ourselves to
Mm-hmm.
analyze the social situation of China. But until now, we haven't developed that kind of theory, so that will be disappointing. I think I think one of the reasons why we haven't have this theory is that the problem of technology have been paid the attention attention by a lot of people. So when we consider the problem of technology, if we can take technology into account, the way how they construct modern life, and that may be opening up a new possibility for us.
I think that's correct. I was struck during my visits to China by the total lack of originality in some areas, like urban transportation.
Yeah.
What a crazy idea to commit such a huge proportion of the resources of a poor country to allowing people to drive around in cars. Unbelievable. I just couldn't understand why. And then, of course, going around Beijing,
Mhm.
it takes an hour to go anywhere. There's so much traffic. So you've got the example of the West, but what's taken is only a little slice. No learning about the problems that emerge once you work with some of these technologies for a while and see what their disadvantages are. And this, I think, is characteristic of the way in which the Chinese industrialization process has gone on,
Mhm.
and it's not a good thing. I mean, I was also very shocked by the milk scandal.
Mm.
You know,
Yes.
the contaminated milk in the West. Similar things, of course, happened. And sometime around 1900, Western societies began to realize they had to regulate food supplies. Because this is no longer, you and your family farm trading with somebody else's family farm. This is industrial production of food on a huge scale, affecting millions of people. You have to regulate it. You have to protect people. But evidently, that wasn't being done. And I just it was shocking that the people in charge had learned how to make um, a system for the production and distribution on an industrial scale of milk, but had not learned that you had to protect people from rapacious producers with regulation and inspection. But this is just as much part of the system in the West as the machines for milking the cows. It doesn't stop with a piece of equipment. It's the whole system you have to integrate. And that includes the means that are employed to protect the population from abuse. So it's the same with the cars. You didn't have to wait until Beijing's air was filthy to find out that there was a problem. You could just look at the history of Los Angeles or London, and you knew there was. So, so this is disturbing. About, of course, the overall effect of Chinese industrialization has been enormously positive from hundreds of millions of people. So I'm not saying that it was a mistake, just that there's a kind of a failure to follow through carefully on the on the importation of technologies, and to understand that they always have um, complicated effects on the environment, and you have to take that into account. You have to learn to handle that, and not just learn how to make the thing. That's part of it. So a technical system is not just an artifact; it's the practices that make the artifact usable, right? And not just the individual practices of users, but the social practices that allow it to fit into the society constructively rather than destructively. And all of that is so important. Maybe this is changing now in China. Huh? Maybe it is changing. I'm hoping that it is changing. Um, I know that there's a great effort at renewable energy in China,
Yes.
and, and that's important. Um, the sooner they can close the coal-fired plants, the better. But well, so I mean, that's about as far as I can go with my reflections on China. I don't really have the expertise to go further, but other people, maybe you can carry it on.
But your observations are all correct, and I think that's the problems you have talked about, like the milk and the air pollution. They are the typical examples of the, I would say, negative impact of industrialization process in China. And I think sometimes it's because people's conscious, if I could say, the technological conscious, that the technology is um, have its finitude, and it will has huge, especially negative influence on our society. Sometimes people haven't realized these problems, but
Yes,
now the the things are changing, and people began to realize that yes, we are relying on technology, but we have to reflect on what kind of impact it will on us, on our society. And now we are kind of opening our eyes to those hidden aspects which we haven't paid attention to in the past.
So we're really here talking about two different types of issues. One is how can the society reproduce some of its most important cultural values through the industrialization process rather than losing its soul and just becoming an imitator of somebody else's culture. That's one set of problems. And then the second set of problems has to do with how can technology be integrated in a way that respects the health of the environment and human health through appropriate regulation and contextualization. And those are two fundamental issues that a developing country needs to address. And philosophy of technology is essential for thinking about those issues. So it's really good that you're working on this subject.
But I think a fundamental question for China's problem of modernity is that the introduction of Western modernity and the industrialization or modernization process has led to a kind of rupture to China's value system or culture system. So if you want to input some values or culture into the process of uh, technological development, sometimes people are confused what kind of value or what kind of culture they could rely on or resort to. So that's the dilemma of China people now they are facing.
Yes. Yeah. And I don't really know the answer. There, I mean, one thing that you notice is the incredible civic consciousness of ordinary Chinese people, which shows up in crises,
Uh,
perhaps not in everyday life where people are so family centered they barely notice the existence of other people outside their family. But um, but in crises, there's this, willingness of huge numbers of people to chip in and to help out and do things.
mhm,
And that's an interesting difference um, with Western societies, which are so much more individualistic. And I don't know how that could be. I mean, it used to be that that was reflected in the architecture of the, what is it, the hutong.
yeah.
The, the Chinese dwellings were based around sort of um, mutual, and even, I mean, I think even in the earlier period of the communist period,
Mhm.
you had collective kitchens in the apartment buildings, just
Yeah.
sort of a carryover, right? So you can see the idea of collaboration, of civic obligation was was built into the structure, the technical system of the urban housing. Um, and maybe there's something there that should be developed. I'm not sure how though. I mean, this is way. I mean, it's certainly in terms of urban transportation, it would make sense to return to collective forms of get rid of this ridiculous idea that a city of 30 million can travel by car. It's just an absurdity. So a collective form of transportation ought to be easily adopted. But I don't know. I mean, it's again, it's outside my area of expertise.
Thank you. And I think you have partly answered the last question. So the last question is, are there some efforts made by China to break the old paths of developing technology in the West that impressed you by now? And do you think they have provided inspiration for new ways of development?
It's likely that there are, but I don't know what they are. Again, I just don't have the expertise. Um, so far, the Chinese path is resembles the Japanese in relying on imitation using and trying to improve on designs that are adopted from the West. I can't think of anything like miniaturization, which would be a really new uh, contribution. But that doesn't mean that it isn't there. I just am not able to identify it. And also, it may be a little early. I mean, between the time when you were born and today, the country has been transformed. And if you think about, if you asked your parents or your grandparents, I
Mhm.
mean, this is really a very fast process of development. So it's not surprising that mistakes are made and that so far there's little evidence of originality. But perhaps in the future, things will surface that are not visible now, or only visible to people who have, a real understanding of what's going on with Chinese technology, which I don't.
So I think maybe Chinese people should put more efforts in understand issues like the development of technology in China, because that is so important for modern life and our connection with the Western society, and how we have been transformed into this world of globalization. So
Yes. I mean, the most difficult thing intellectually, culturally, is for people to um, get the idea that they can be original, that they can think for themselves, that they're not just imitators of Western models, but that um, they can be critical with respect to those models instead of just imitating them. So that that's going to take some time, I think. But the starting point has to be in the intellectual world. It has to be among scholars, and they have to philosophers have to get the attention of engineers and scientists and talk to them and communicate to them this um, the flexibility of development, right? Modern development is not just fixed once and for all by a pattern set up in the West. It can branch off in new directions. Some of those directions have been explored in the West, and they could be adopted in preference to the dominant models. So where did the automobile come from in China? What gave the government the idea that it was worth spending, I don't know how much, must be 10 or 20% of the country's wealth on on automobiles. Did that come from imitating Americans? Because if they had been looking to France or Holland, they would have seen countries where people take the bus and ride bicycles. Chinese used to ride bicycles. That's considered a very modern form of transportation in Denmark and Holland. So it's a question, looking around with a more critical eye and seeing where you can find convergences between things that are native to your culture and things that have been done elsewhere. And um, there's a whole agenda there to work out.
yeah, but I think the case in China is more complicated since its political situation and
Well,
cultural condition is kind of mm, it's really hard to analysis since the ideology and also culture both have experienced um, I would say sudden change in the last
yes.
100 years. So and and I think that's the reason why we find that the problems of China are particularly difficult to analysis and very different from the case in the West and in Japan.
Well, it's yeah, the political system of China is unique. There's nothing like it anywhere else.
Yeah.
And it has advantages and disadvantages. Um, it, I don't really know how that will affect the development of technology in China. Um, it certainly makes it possible to do big things.
Hmm.
You know, you can commit billions of dollars to a project and see it through. It's very interesting, actually, what's happening with Huawei.
Mm. Yeah.
Huawei can't get chips in the U.S. anymore, and so Trump thinks that's a big deal. And I'm sure that people in the Chinese government are saying, "Aha, now we'll make our own chips and we'll make them so good and so cheap that we'll destroy those American companies that think they can monopolize chip making worldwide." You can
Yeah.
do this stuff like that in China.
They
So
talk about things like that for several years, I think.
yeah, well, it's perfectly realistic. It's going to happen.
Mhm.
So that's the advantage. But some of that, sometimes, of course, that leads to terrible mistakes, like the automobilization of Beijing, which is an insane idea. Um, so, but it could lead to very original developments. So we'll have to, but that depends largely on cultural factors,
Yeah.
not just on politics, but on culture, on what, how people start thinking about their lives and what they're doing, and not just philosophers in universities, but engineers and scientists, technical workers. Um, so there's a place for philosophy in this process of cultural change that needs to happen.
Yes, definitely. We need more reflections and also more actions, I think, and more cooperations from the different aspects of our society and the different groups of people.
Yeah.
And yes, so there are last two questions raised by Professor Lucy Gao, even she is not there
Ah,
here. So
what did she ask?
yeah, she asked if there are different modernities, how should we understand modernity as a whole? That is the first question raised by her.
Um,
I think
let
you
me
can
see.
read it in the.
Yeah. If there are different modernities, how should you understand modernity as a whole?
Mhm,
Um, well, that I think has to do with the role of rationality in social life, which is going to be important, overwhelmingly important in any modern society. So uh, it's not that people weren't rational before, it's just that their institutions were not organized around what we think of as rational forms, like bureaucratic systems with strict rules, or markets with fixed prices, and technologies with impacts on every aspect of life, not just a few aspects. So that's what makes a society modern. And that will be true of an alternative modernity if one is created, a better one than the one we're in.
mhm.
But it'll be different in other respects. It'll incorporate those rational institutions and culture in a different manner. So now she had a second part to her question. We find out that any that we should have a second session to talk about the second part of her question, because it would take me a long time to explain how I have appropriated ideas from science and technology studies. Um,
Yes, but I think that's really an innovation you made in your theory.
yeah.
So maybe next time we can organize an interview on that aspect of your theory. which I also interested in, and writing a article, not article, it's a paper on this topic.
Good. Well, you can show me your paper if you can, or at least a summary of it in English. I can't read Chinese. So, uh,
Yes, of course.
yeah.
I finished,
Now,
I can translate it into English instead of
yeah, good. Okay, I think we are done.